Hello, strangers. As we do every Tuesday, we're here for another story today. This one is story 11. My mother left when I was 10. I guess you could blame that for why I never learned to be a girly girl. I was instead drawn into the whole scene kid aesthetic. There was something about those brightly smiling brunettes on the fashion magazines my mom had left behind. Their smiles felt insincere, just like hers did, when she smiled and then bailed on us for a new man and a bigger city than she could get in suburban Cudahy, Wisconsin. My dad did his best, but he was understandably at a loss when it came to French braids and mascara, so he let me grow and dress how I wanted. We were, and are, still close. Come my first year of college, I chose the closest I could so I could still come see him on weekends and breaks. This turned out all right. While at college, I found close friendship with other girls, and they encouraged me to explore dating for the first time in my life. Maybe that's why, when a tall blonde guy with a toothpaste-ad smile stopped by my table during a cram session, and after the usual college icebreakers of, "What's your year? What's your major?" asked me out to dinner, I said yes. Even as he walked away, my phone number jotted on a spare index card in his pocket. I couldn't help but be surprised. Tom looked like Mr. All-American Boy next door, down to the senior varsity letterman jacket and perfect straight hair parted down the middle so the front pieces floated around his green eyes. I, on the other hand, had my half-red, half-black hair in stubby pigtails, a baggy sweatshirt from my dad's work obscuring my figure, and a makeup look known affectionately as last night's eyeliner. This wasn't just opposites attract, this was something on a different level. Still, at my friend's urging, I went through with the date, thinking it would be shallow of me to say no to a guy just because of the way he looked. The next night, a Thursday, as I only had a 1 p.m. class on Fridays and Tom none at all, I got dressed and set out to meet him at the little Italian restaurant he'd picked. I'd never driven out that way, and I took much longer than I'd planned getting ready. While I had looked up the directions on MapQuest, I didn't have much time to consult the printout as I drove on into the early dark. I must have taken a wrong turn or selected the scenic route as I ended up on a long two-laner skirting the city limits, the blackness only occasionally interrupted by a streetlight doing its best to beat back the dark. Now, if you've ever driven out in rural Wisconsin, you'll know that deer are a persistent threat. They hang back in the brush next to roads, and like moths to a flame, will appear like magic in front of headlights. My dad had a few Bambi bangs on his work truck. He had drilled into me that I needed to be wary of their suicidal tendencies. I checked my speed, going 5 below the limit, and seeing in my peripheral vision the occasional rack of antlers peeking from behind the brush as I drove past. A red glow in the distance alerted me to a stoplight standing watch over the desolate four-way where the road I was on intersected with another. perfect. I thought I remembered from the MapQuest directions that this was to be my right-hand turn back into the city proper, but as I pulled up to the intersection, I was already reaching for the printout, wanting to double-check. I looked, and was glad I did. This was the four-way before the right-hand turn, so I was to proceed straight. I put the directions down and awaited the lights change to green. But as the song playing on the radio gave way to a car insurance commercial, then a fast food restaurant ad, and finally back to music, the light stayed red. Puzzled, I looked around the intersection. No headlights, no approaching engines. As far as I could see, mine was the only car for miles, and I the only living thing. I soon found out I was wrong. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye and turned to look out the driver's side window. There, standing in the weeds on the other side of the street, was the tallest deer I'd ever seen. Not biggest. It was skeletally thin, but tall like a moose. And worse, the deer was staring back at me. I locked eyes, unable to look away. Its eyes glowed in the red cast from the stoplight, still red and barring me from taking off. I chanced a glance at it, flicking my eyes right to it, without turning my face away from the deer. I was spooked by this deer's appearance, both by how suddenly it had appeared and how sickly it looked. But the worst part was his awareness of me. It didn't glance about, not once. It simply stood, stock still, its head turned directly at me, assessing me. Another glance to the stoplight, still red. I couldn't hear the radio. It was still there, no static, but my heartbeat in my ears was drowning it out. I glanced back at the deer. It was still staring at me. But, oh no. Now there was movement, something new and horrible for me to deal with. At first, I thought it was shifting its weight, or worse, steadying itself to charge my car. No such luck. As I stared into its eyes, its face slid up, 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 as the deer stood up on its hind legs, settling into knees that deer do not have. The deer stood up on its two back legs like a person, but not a person, but not a deer. What? My stomach dropped like a rock as the deer that was moving like it was not a deer took one long, lumbering step out of the brush and onto the street, its hoof making a dull click. My foot slammed onto the gas pedal, and I peeled out of there without a second thought. I don't know if the light was broken. I don't know why MapQuest had me driving out in the boondocks. I really don't know what that thing even was. But I do know I actually felt the pedal hit the floor as I jolted out of that surreal scene and back to civilization. My heart was pounding as I made the next right-hand turn, and after ascending a decently sized incline, the lights of the city appeared like a struck match. I drove through a couple of one-way streets, pulled into the paid parking, and sat there for a moment, collecting myself. I glanced at the clock on the radio. While the encounter had felt like I'd stared into that ghostly deer's face for hours, and despite my leaving late, I was somehow 5 minutes early for the date. It gave me time to take a breath, settle my pounding heart. What was that? How did a deer stand up like, well, like not a deer? But I'd made it away, and on time for this date. Right, Tom. I had decided not to tell Tom what had happened almost as soon as the thought occurred to me. It just didn't seem like first date material. So I got out of the car, straightened the hem on my dress, locked the car, and walked into the restaurant. When I sighted Tom inside, we greeted each other with a half hug and no stories about demonic wildlife. So far, so good. But this newly acquired normal didn't last long. The dinner was fine, with Tom asking a lot of questions, but when I'd ask about him, he'd give something short and impersonal before turning the focus back on me. Maybe he was just being polite. After all, I'd heard many stories from friends, both male and female, about lousy dates where the date only wanted to monologue about themselves. Maybe Tom had had those dates too, and was wanting to avoid this scenario so badly, he aggressively turned the conversation back to me each time, like volleying a tennis ball. He also kept bringing up wine. Now, I was underage, but this was a college town, and likely the restaurant would have poured me a glass with no problem. If you're not from that area, you may not know how thoroughly alcohol has seeped into our culture, to the point that our humble state is number one in drunk driving. I guess that's why I didn't really have any alarm bells go off when Tom asked me if I wanted some wine. I said no thank you, yet after I went to the bathroom, I came back to a glass beside my water and bread plate. I demurred as I gently reminded him I had driven to the date and didn't want to risk driving under the influence. But Tom told me that's okay. He thought maybe after dinner there was this scenic vista by his house that he'd love to drive me to. Now, Tom didn't know I'd had the run-in with nature that evening, and thus his planned outing was the opposite of what I wanted to do. And I was still in the mind that telling him was a giant mistake. But I also didn't want to shoot him down in a crowded restaurant. So I smiled and asked if he was into nature, like hiking and camping. He smiled back, sidestepping the question and turning it back to me, like he'd been doing all night. It was strange. Dates are for getting to know people, right? But family, hobbies, sports teams, even the most basic questions, Tom avoided answering, deferring to me to answer instead. It was plain weird. But he was charming and polite at the same time. I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was Tom. Maybe it was the deer. Maybe it was the not a deer. But the whole night just felt off, tilted like a hotel room painting. I passed on dessert, at which Tom finally had something to say. That he liked that people who made a habit of ordering the creme brulee didn't care about their bodies. Maybe he meant it as a compliment, but I just felt uneasy. He paid the bill for dinner, even though I was already pulling out my wallet to go Dutch. Then he escorted me out to the parking lot. It turned out he'd been parked in the space in front of where I'd pulled in. It was his truck bed my car hood was nosed up against. As we walked, he again brought up wanting to take me to the scenic vista he'd mentioned over dinner. I was trying to think of a polite way to beg off when I happened to look at the rear window of his truck's passenger cab. For a guy so determined to keep himself to himself, he had stickers on his truck window. Well, actually just one sticker. It was one of those mudflap girl silhouettes perched on the passenger side of the glass. Okay, so he liked girls. That wasn't the weirdest part, or what drew my attention so thoroughly that his latest encouragement to join him for the scenic drive faded into the background. See, the sticker was a mudflap girl from the neck down. Her head had been replaced with the head of a deer, antlers and all. Of all the decals, one showing pride for his college or his frat, or a state park one for Highcliffe or Devil's Lake, even a cartoon boy peeing on a car logo, any of these stickers would have said innocuous, fun, local pride. Why on earth would he choose deer head, sexy lady body? Was he a super fan of true crime? A furry? Really into Fanta Pop? It was the final misshapen cherry on this strange Sunday of a night. Maybe it was his evasiveness about any details of who he was as a person. Maybe it's the fact that his truck, which cost at least 60 to 70 grand, was barren of any personal touch, save showcasing an image that wouldn't look out of place in a serial killer's journal. Maybe it was my whole observation of how mismatched we were. Quiet alternative girl versus Mr. All-American. The whole thing seemed like a setup for a nasty prank. Or was it the not a deer? Looking back, that thing's appearance at the crossroads that night, locking its red-rimmed eyes with mine as it slowly stood up on hind legs with human joints. With all of these red flags flashing through my head, I looked up into Tom's green eyes and toothpaste-ad smile, and politely but firmly told him I'd had fun, but it was late and I wanted to get home. His smile slipped, but only for a second. He was disappointed, but was picking up that to continue his cajoling wouldn't change my mind. He leaned down, gave me a kiss on the cheek, and said, "Another time then." We parted ways, and I drove off, this time through town. As you may have already guessed, there would be no other time. University campus was large enough, and our majors different. I didn't run into him in any common areas. I only saw him in passing on the promenade, and when his eyes met mine, they were cold, prompting the polite smile of greeting to slip from my face. He was set to graduate the following year, and must have done, for I didn't see him on campus the following fall, or ever again throughout the next years of my college education. I did all right for myself, though. I made some really good friends, most of whom were fellow alternative/recovering scene kids like me. It was through one of these friends, a short, tiny framed girl named Shelby, that Tom would reappear in my thoughts. Shelby and I happened to attend the same Take Back the Night event. As far as I knew, we were both there to be supportive, not because we'd personally experienced any harrowing tale. At this event, though, Shelby told her story. While I had been lucky enough to avoid what statistically could have befallen me, she hadn't been. She spoke of her freshman year, how she'd been in one of the on-campus coffee shops, reading through Intro to Calculus, when a preppy guy had approached her, all charm and green eyes. She was perplexed. Shelby was a goth, shaved eyebrows and labrae piercing and stuff. What could his interest be? I felt my ears whoosh with sudden blood flow, feeling all prickly. I hadn't thought about Tom in years, but I knew she was talking about him before I'd even asked her later on, and she'd confirmed it. He'd picked her up for dinner, but afterwards asked if he could come back to her dorm. Shelby was a bit of a party girl, and not as awkward as I. For her own reasons, she had said yes. Once in her apartment, he'd changed from easygoing to insistent. Even though she'd said no, first nicely, but finally very clearly, and with tears spilling out of her eyes, he'd pulled off her clothes, laying his much larger body on top of hers, and had kept her there, pinned to the floor of her bedroom, until he finished. She'd frozen, not moving as he did, got up, pulled his pants back up and zipped, and then leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. He told her he'd call her. He said this like a promise, not a threat to return and do this to her again. Then he just left. Shelby had never reported the incident. How could she? She was a girl known for drinking, partying, and dating a lot. Line her up next to the boy next door, and who'd believe her? She sobbed suddenly, and as I moved to embrace her, she said, "I knew it had to be a trick. Why did I go along with it? Stupid, stupid idiot." And from there, just strangled sobs and other insults directed at herself. I told her over and over it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't read his mind and know he'd attack her, any more than her bubbly partygoer rep or facial piercings had asked for or consented to it. We all told her that, but it never seemed to help. I graduated soon after, with plans to move back home to Cudahy, while I circulated my CV to land a job. The morning I left campus, I got up super early, moved the cartons of clothes and books down to my trusty car, and began the drive home. It was dark as I drove, with a few legs of the drive petering down to one-laners each way, driving through rural and wooded areas. As I came to a stop at a T-junction, the cold feeling reappeared in my stomach even before I turned to look out the passenger side window. Still as a statue stood the not a deer. It was a deer, impossibly tall and emaciated, and I knew it was the same one from all those nights ago. My stomach had that same falling feeling as I felt my forehead and upper lip prickle with sweat that ran cold in the early morning chill. He looked just as he had that night, like he'd been photoshopped out of my memory into this one. He regarded me, then turned back into the brush, and slowly, mercifully on 4 legs, walked into the tree line. Feeling entranced, like the weight of my eyes was too heavy for me to move it away from him, I took my foot off the brake, and as I slowly rolled into the intersection, I was able to watch him. I wanted to look away, I really did. My brain was screaming dream logic at me, like if I looked too long at him, the worst thing I could imagine would happen. But I couldn't drag my eyes off of him. Somewhere in my car, I heard the quiet ding of my phone. I was fully into the intersection when, as though the thing outside the window was on the same group chat and heard the same notification, he stopped. With a slow turn of his head towards me, he slowly began to stand up on his back legs. I floored it. I confirmed it was him, and now my eyes were streaming with tears. My brain had had to know, and now it couldn't stand knowing. When I arrived back home, my dad greeted me in the driveway, helping me carry my few belongings inside into my old room. I had a text from a mutual friend of mine and Shelby's. Shelby had attempted to take her own life. I called the friend, who told me there'd been some online resource Shelby had been using to connect with other people who went through what she did. She was following a lot of topic threads on assault, finding familiarity, being the staunch voice telling people they weren't the problem, that they were believed, that they were loved, all the things she couldn't hear for herself. On one of these topic threads that day, a post had been placed. But unlike the usual posts about personal accounts or someone calling a piece of pop culture into question regarding themes that seemed to support something dark, predatory, this post was asking about personal experience. Not the personal experience of being a survivor of crime. It asked for anecdotes from perpetrators, the assailants. One of the most upvoted posts had been a guy, entirely unremorseful, who laid out his methodology for preying on girls. He was a straight-A student, an athlete from a legacy family at his college. His prey? Alternative, no-name girls that he admitted were B-list at best in comparison, more introverted. He'd take them out, get their guard down with dinner and acting like the perfect gentleman, letting them do all the talking and being that great listener so few guys seemed to be. Once dinner was over and their defenses lowered, he'd ask if he could come back to theirs, their home, meaning he'd appeared to have been invited. making any report immediately explained away as she consented, but then changed her mind after. Also, it was her place, meaning the girl ostensibly had the home court advantage and could just have asked me to leave. He counted on their outsider status, their lack of reputation in the community, and even the way they dressed, all of these to protect him from reports and accusations. Looking at the two of them, it would be too easy to see who'd be believed. He'd preyed on them, got what he wanted to take from them, and having graduated, now wrote his addition to the post while he occupied the charmed and successful life his status afforded him. As the post was anonymous, he wrote, he'd continue to live that perfect life as his admission amounted to nothing that could be used against him as evidence, with statute of limitations running out all the while. He could float just as unaffected through the hate this post received, which was immense, as he did away from his crime, happy, proud even, to identify what a monster he was, but smugly withholding his name and identifying information so that no one could do anything about it. He didn't need to identify himself, though. Upon reading, both Shelby and I knew, just like I'd known looking at the deer thing, that if I looked too long, it would look back. I knew. We knew. The author was a tall blonde with green eyes who drove a truck with a weird window decal and called himself Tom. The world is a funny, messed up place with life-changing events sprinkled in by chance. For whatever reason, I was spared Tom's predatory habits, or rather, I was warned. I'm not big into religion of any stripe, but a couple of years back, I retold these events to a friend who was very into symbolism and mysticism. Her take was that deer are symbols of both purity and alertness. Purity, I don't know. She didn't see the bony, stretched-out deer thing that I saw, or get momentarily lost looking at him, into him. But I can buy alertness. If I hadn't been so spooked, would Tom's ploy have worked on me? Would the bizarre sticker have been enough to save me by itself, without my senses already being on high alert for strange deer? Or would I have done the polite, non-confrontational thing and gone along with what Tom wanted? To the scenic vista, back to my apartment, and then, well, I'll never know. There's little point in analyzing it. I'll just always be grateful, thankful for the deer in my headlights and how for once it saved me from trouble. And that's the story for today. If you liked it, feel free to press the corresponding button. If you have something to say about it, please use the comments. And if you want to be reminded or notified when stories like these drop, you can hit the subscribe button. And I think notifications on gives you about a 57% chance of actually being notified, at least from personal experience. Well, until next time, take care, strangers.